Hello, everybody. Thank you for checking in to our now temporarily virtual author series. It's with some, just like last month with Justin Aaron, it's with some sadness that we are not able to continue our in-person series, but of course that's the new reality. And the silver lining of all this is we're now able to make sure we are still doing these things and able to record them for posterity and hopefully reach a wider audience. And I want to reach a wider audience today with a very worthy author and friend, Jeanne Mcculloch. And let me introduce her and her book. And she's going to do a short reading from the book, which you'll enjoy. And then we have a bunch to talk about memoir and writing and life. So without further ado, Jeanne Mcculloch is former managing editor of the Paris Review, senior editor of Tin House, and the founding editorial director of Tin House Books. She's the co-founder of the Todos Santos Writers Workshop. Her work has appeared in the Paris Review, Tin House, the New York Times Book Review, Vogue, O Magazine, Allure, the Northwestern Review, and many other publications. She is, of course, also the author of the memoir All Happy Families, and she lives in Brooklyn, New York. Jeanne, welcome. I'm thrilled to have a chance to chat with you. And I'll say, by way of double introduction, we have been starstruck, or whatever the right cliche is. We've tried to do this conversation for quite some time, and we've had travel, health, and now current events, but we made it happen. The show must go on. So here we are finally having our author series chat. Before I bring you in, I just want to say, official disclaimer, I read and loved this book. In fact, I've read it twice, and I'd be remiss not to celebrate right up front what an amazing title you chose. Many writers and readers will recognize that from the immortal opening line of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, but I think for any work, it would be a resonant title that speaks volumes, but for a memoir and a deeply personal family story, it's about as good as you can do. So Jeanne, welcome, and say hello, and feel free to read a section from your book.
Okay, thank you, Sean. It's delightful to be with you all virtually. I was sorry not to get back down to Winchester, which is fast becoming one of my favorite places to visit. It's a literary community in the bud of creation, and I'm happy to be a part of it. But anyway, here we are together now. I'm going to read the very beginning of All Happy Families, my memoir that came out in 2018 from HarperCollins. And then I guess Sean and I will have a conversation about the art of memoir and anything else that he wants to know about. I will say, just because you mentioned the title All Happy Families, I was actually stunned that title had never been used before. I had a very long list of possible titles, much like I had a very long list every time I had a child of possible names. And my editor was vetoing most of them. And then one day I thought, All Happy Families. I just thought of that quote, all happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own fashion. And I called her up, and they looked it up, the powers that be at HarperCollins, and said, no, it's never been used. And to me, it's sort of the portrait of the dysfunction that exists in any family, which is really why probably the memoir form begins to make any kind of sense to anybody, and why we write them. But we'll talk about that more. Anyway, I'm going to read just the opening chapter, and that'll set it up, and then we can chat, and I look forward to that. Okay.
Great.
Part 1, August 1983. A woman walks into the sea. It's a mid-August day, early morning. The sky is clear. A mid-August day on the beach near the end of Long Island, and it's the summer of 1983. Seagulls idle on the wet sand, and far out the fishing boats from Montauk patrol, small as dark toys against the horizon. It's a perfect late summer day. The woman on the shore is my mother. She wears the iconic headdress of her era, a floral bathing cap with brightly colored petals. She walks cautiously, hands out for balance, because even in a calm surf, You can't be too careful walking into the sea. She always taught us that, respect for the sea. The latex petals of her cap flutter around her head, almost festive as she moves. It's early morning, and my mother walks into the sea. Behind her is our house, a long, gray, sea-weathered clapboard house, stretching across a sand dune like a giant sleeping cat. My father bought this house years before the area became known as the Hamptons, back when it was still considered a long way from New York City, known mainly for artists and potato fields, and the fishermen who made their living trawling off Montauk Point. The house had a shabby grandeur to it that time forgot. No air conditioning. The sea is our air conditioner, my mother would proclaim. And no pool. The sea is our pool. Every August when I was young, it was a giant slumber party in the house by the sea. My sisters and I would fall asleep against a tumble of cousins and quilts, listening to the steady refrain of waves gliding along the shore, the moonlight outside our bedroom spackling a silver route to the horizon. August 13th, 1983 was the day of my wedding. I was 25, a messy splatter of freckles across my nose, the final badge of childhood. Just before sunset that afternoon, I would put on a vintage lace dress that swooped gently off the shoulder in a style I saw as reminiscent of Sophia Loren in her glory days, and my mother saw as suggestive of the sale rack at a yard sale. In the house that morning, they were talking in various rooms. In the pantry, the boy delivering flowers, sprays of lilies of the valley, and a basket of rose petals for the wedding cake, was being bossed around by Johanna, the Irish cook. Johanna never got to boss anybody in the household. Everyone, the housekeeper, the gardener, everyone disregarded her. She was a small woman in a hairnet whose wisps of dry black hair nevertheless escaped and were often found floating in the vichyssoise. She stamped her foot, a white orthopedic shoe. "Get out of my kitchen," she was telling the delivery boy from the florist shop. "I'm too busy," she scolded. "Go." In the sunroom, my half-brothers, 3 men in their early 40s, sons from my father's first marriage, huddled in conversation. They all had beards and ready laughs. They had come for the wedding with their spouses and their children from the far-flung places where they lived lives of their own. Half siblings, and the term was apt. I half knew them, and I half didn't. Scott raised llamas in New Mexico. In Florida, Keith painted lush floral landscapes, some with naked women. In Colorado, Rod was engaged in investment strategies for a business no one understood. In my father's sunroom, the morning light angled across the sisal rug. Dust motes played in the air, and my 3 half-brothers were talking together, shoulders hunched, coffee mugs in hand. My wedding was scheduled to take place at 5 in the afternoon. It had been timed and debated for months, the proper moment for a wedding. The ceremony was to be situated by the garden, up by the house, with a view giving out to the sea. Situated. That was the term used by Ruth Ann Middleton, the professional wedding planner my mother had hired to marshal the wedding to perfection. A white wire gazebo had been placed there, and the florist would wreath the lattice in garlands of pink roses. 5 in the afternoon was the time the light would be that rich gold particular to late summer. A bagpiper in a kilt had been hired by my mother, so at the ceremony's conclusion, he'd guide the guests from the garden down to the tent, braying the union of husband and wife as the setting sun burnished rose through the trees. You know, men in kilts don't wear any underwear, my half-brother Keith had told us the day before the wedding as we drove to visit our father. Seriously, you guys, not a stitch, just a pink ribbon tied around the big fella. My siblings and I were in the family station wagon when he told us that, on our way to Southampton Hospital. Our father lay in a coma in the ICU, having had a massive stroke 2 days before the wedding, leaving our home for what we suspected might be the last time, strapped to an ambulance stretcher. The strap, a thin final harness to our life. He'd had the stroke following an abrupt withdrawal from alcohol after a lifetime of drinking, having gone cold turkey at my mother's insistence, so, in her words, he'd sober up for the wedding. On the way to the hospital, my brother Scott had insisted we stop at the fried chicken place off Route 27 in case we got hungry. And as we stood watching our father breathe, the bucket of chicken sat unopened at the nurse's station of the ICU, filling the air with its irrelevant fragrance. We had bowed to my mother's insistence that the wedding should go forward despite our father's condition, because, she claimed, it's what Daddy would want. Besides, she added, all my friends are already en route. And so a man with no underwear in a plaid skirt was going to bray on our front lawn at sunset as my father lay in a coma over in the next town. The morning of my wedding, an easy breeze blew down the beach. My teenage nephews sat on their surfboards just beyond the break. All was calm and serene from the lilting vantage point of the sea. Occasionally a swell would captivate them, and they would angle their boards towards the shore, riding in on elegant curls of foam. Later that afternoon, my mother would pin the family veil on my head. She'd mutter about how I should have let her get a proper hairdresser to tame my wild beach hair. Then she'd call the hospital and instruct them that no matter what happened that evening to her husband, they were not to call our house. Because, she'd go on to say, we were having a party. The morning of August 13th, 1983, the day settled into a steady rhythm near the tip of Long Island. Taking her swim before breakfast, which she believed was de rigueur in summertime, my mother walked into the sea. So that's the first chapter.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And, you know, it's funny, I've read it several times, and I think that's at least the second time I've heard you read it. So it's that's the best way to kick this off. Speaking for myself, I think I can confirm my own assessment, which is, you know, any work that is successful and hopes to remain relevant has to stand the cliched test of time and context. I think that's doubly true with a memoir, especially a deeply personal memoir. And I think your memoir succeeds spectacularly because, as the title invokes, you're talking about one of the main universal themes across time and trend and culture and context, which is the dysfunctional family. You know, all families are dysfunctional in similar and dissimilar ways. But I think, you know, particularly for people that are fascinated by memoir, whether as readers or aspiring writers, is how to connect with some of these universal truths while telling a deeply personal story. Maybe you can speak a little bit about how that unfolded for you, how difficult or easy that was. But I just want to say, as a fellow writer and someone who's written about writing, And for those of you out there, we don't want to discourage anyone. In fact, the whole point of this is to encourage, but it's a very tricky balance to make it universal and relatable while also being very true to the story being told.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. There were two, I will talk about how I came to write this memoir, but there were two driving factors. I wanted to write about family dysfunction, and I wanted to write about alcoholism in a family and the damage it can do. And one of the things that family dysfunction and alcoholism have in common, they come hand in hand in a family. They're equal opportunity diseases, both of them, or conditions, I guess we could say. That is probably why, as a foundational impulse for a memoir, it made it possible to start to wade through these things and try to tell a story that was universal. But I always keep in mind, and I keep it on my desk, sort of as an informational tool that I refer back to, and I'm constantly telling my students, the Vivian Gornick statement that a memoir is not what happened to a writer. We all have anecdotes that make good stories at a dinner table. A memoir is what the writer makes of what happened to them. And that takes a long time to really figure out. If the impulse for writing a memoir is negative, if it's malicious in any way, it's not going to get you where you want to go. If you are telling a story because I think we all carry what Gornick again referred to as the bruised weight of childhood. If you are telling it solely to get it off your chest and solely because you're either pissed at somebody or you want to prove somebody right, it's not going to get you where you want to go. You really have to sit and think about what is the greater truth here. What will my story at the end of the day teach other people? Why would a reader pick it up? And a narrative arc being what it is, beginning, middle, end, by the end, the hope of any memoirist is that the reader feels that they have come along with you on a journey. And I believe there has to be a journey of understanding and resolution. There's a situation, there's a grappling with it, and then there's some kind of resolution at the end. And I've read many memoirs that are successful in many, many ways, but they leave these sort of dangling bits that aren't resolved at the end, and those things nag at one. So I thought a lot about that as I entered into this. The very short version of how I came to write this is, I had written a piece about growing up in the house that is presented in what I read. And it was for an anthology on money, actually. And I was commissioned to write it by an editor who was sort of, rather than the rags to riches story, which is a wonderful story, the riches to rags story was more what I was emblematic of. And she was hoping to nail some truism about family dysfunction, that what looks good isn't always perfect, right? And there's as much dysfunction behind the hedgerow as there is in another family. So I had written that, an editor had seen it in the anthology and had offered me a book contract to expand it into a book. And it happened in my personal life to be a good time to do that. Tin House Books, which I was the founder of, was moving to Portland, Oregon to be a small press. And I had young children still. We were not going to move across the country. And so it seemed a good time to be digging into something else. So I did something I'd always told my own writers and students never to do, which is I accepted a book contract for a book that I had no idea how to write or what it was going to be about. And then I proceeded to dither for a very long time. And occasionally I would go to my editor, we'd have lunch, and I'd be grasping at things. And I kept hoping she'd sort of nail one down for me. But she's a great editor in this way, Karen Rinaldi. She was like, that's not my job. That's your job. So I proceeded to dither a little bit more. And then I read, or maybe I heard, an interview with Dani Shapiro, who's a memoirist I greatly admire, in which she said that often your story, the story you need to tell, is embedded in the story that you've never told anybody, an incident in your life that you've never really fully addressed. And that happened around the same time I was moving into a new office. And I had asked, we put a lot of stuff in storage. And I asked the movers to bring one box of books to my office because I wanted to go through it. They brought the wrong box, but they brought a box that was labeled Summer of 1983. So there it all was. Everything that I had sort of pushed aside was literally staring me in the face. And I had one file on the top that said wedding, and I opened it up, and it was all condolence notes that had been written by people shortly after the wedding. And they all said some version of, congratulations on your nuptials. We are so sorry for your loss.
Wow.
So I thought, okay, this is it. I have to write about that fateful weekend and the repercussions that it had, not only in my own family, but also in the family of the groom over a 20-year period. So I would say the dithering took a long time, but once I figured out what it was I was going to write about, the actual writing of it didn't take as long as I would have necessarily imagined. I was very worried about family in it, and that was something I wanted to be very careful about, and I'm not sure that I was entirely successful in respect. I felt I respected my own family in writing it, but I probably should have given the more distant family members who were also involved more of a heads up than I did about it. I did tell my immediate family about it. But, you know, I think people get very caught up in, I can't write a memoir because I don't remember everything.
Yeah.
And I think what you have to sit with and come to accept is that memory is emotional truth. And if you've remembered something, there's pretty likely a good reason for it. So if you take that as true, that frees you up a bit. But then you do have to be cautious with the people who shared the experience from their own perspective and not risk telling their story too.
Yeah.
So that's a long way of explaining the various thickets I went through in coming to write this book.
Well, thank you for that. And I think there's a lot to unpack there. But first off, Behind the Hedgerow, there's a title right there.
Yeah, I think it's been used, actually, unfortunately.
That's fantastic. I think the two critical things that you address there and are critical for anyone hoping to write or understand memoir are you know, there's a lot to unpack, right? But the two things to me that seem of paramount concern are this whole notion of truth, which at the outset maybe sounds pretentious, like what is truth? But it's not a philosophical debate so much as a genuine kind of strategic notion for a writer to understand. And I think both in what you talked about, you succeeded in. I think one has to grapple with what the truth they're telling is and be very respectful as far as that goes to the others that are involved, but also know that it's your story to tell and you have to own it, which also gives you the responsibility to convey it accurately and that emotional truth. But the idea that, you hear about detectives saying there's 10 eyewitnesses in that room for that crime and not a single person recounts it the same way. That's something that presumably just happened like that day or that week. So when we're talking about memories from childhood, I think it almost is a comfort, I think, at a certain point when you recognize nobody's going to tell the story the same way. And I think the reader then can determine, is the author trying to get even with someone, or is the author trying to make themselves look good? And the emotional truth will win out. But then the other thing you talk about, which I had planned to address, so we've already teed it up, is this notion of, I think, unlike, say, a novel, a memoirist inevitably needs both time and perspective, especially if they're talking about trauma or traumatic events, because as you alluded to earlier, if you're writing a score settle, keep it in a journal, or keep it as dinner conversation. But that's not art, and even if there are scores to settle, settling them artistically, and again getting back to that universal, so that it resonates with different readers of different ages, I think is what separates the amateur attempts from the professional attempts. But maybe talk a little bit more about, you already addressed it pretty perfectly, but the notion of emotional truth versus truth. And also this notion of, and I'm sure you talk about this a lot as when you teach, the idea of you probably need time, because if you're still angry or sad, the real writing is not going to resonate.
Yeah, it's funny, I just this week revisited a book I go back to from time to time, which is The Letters of Maxwell Perkins, the legendary 20th century editor of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Thomas Wolfe, all sorts of people. And there's some real gems in there, but one in particular was advice he was writing to the son of a friend of his. The friend had said, could you give my boy some advice about writing? And it was just a beautifully succinct way of saying, true writing is not what just happened. That's true journalism. What's true writing is accepting the time it's going to take to get some true perspective. What I had told my two sisters was that I was writing this book and that we each had our own versions of the story. Of course we did. Our father died that weekend. I just wanted to tell the story from the perspective of the bride. And I think for them, they both said to me afterwards that they would have obviously told it slightly differently, but they accepted that was my truth. And I think the emotional truth is probably what remains, that lives with you year after year after year when other things have gone away. And if you think about it, of course, other people who were also there are going to have different emotional truths. I mean, one of my sisters was 20 years old. She was just graduating from college. My other sister was starting out in a career, and that they all bring their own personal experience into anything. And that's what I think, creates the Rashomon effect in anything, right? My half siblings, though, who were much older, they were 20 years older than we were, they were there too. And those are the ones I regret not having given a heads up to more than I did. I sort of thought as though I naively believed that it was so distant that it wouldn't really matter, but I believe it did. And that I regret. That's something I've learned for the next time, if there's a next time.
Well, and I think, again, I'm speaking also from personal experience that I just think the writer at some point has to appreciate that, the ultimate arbiter of whether it's successful has to at least begin with the author, because if you're not sufficiently satisfied with how you've rendered this, how dare you hope a reader that doesn't know you is going to be satisfied? But also with memoir, kind of accepting that, and that's when I talk about that notion of responsibility. You know that you're probably not going to get universal approval from everyone that was involved, but that responsibility assures that you're making it clear through the writing when you're talking about personal views, personal relation of things that happened, as opposed to trying to do journalism or masquerading and hiding behind. I think it's something a lot of young writers learn in workshops, even with fiction, right? You don't have the luxury to be there when the person's reading it and say, oh, no, that actually happened, so you can't critique it. It's like, well, that's not writing. The whole point is, whether it happened or not, it has to feel right. And you invoke Perkins. One of the authors that really influenced me, and I'd love to invoke, a deeply personal, important book for me, was Tim O'Brien's Things They Carried.
Yeah.
Because he actually really kind of breaks that third stage and goes there, which I think was revolutionary at the time, and addresses the reader and talks about how he's struggling with some of these recollections, and the things that are perhaps reading as the most authentic are made up of whole cloth, and the things that aren't are, and he, talks about, I want the reader to understand there's something more real than truth, and he puts it in quotation marks. And that's what I meant when I was saying it could sound pretentious or philosophical, but I think it's something all writers really have to wrestle with, in fiction or nonfiction. It's not, you can't justify the success of the writing by saying, but it actually happened. Well, then you told it badly, or you chose the wrong platform to convey that truth.
The one book that I think, well, I can actually think of two off the top of my head, memoirs that address that and almost use the techniques of the unreliable narrator in memoir, which actually seems like a contradiction in terms, and in a way it is. But David Carr, who was a New York Times writer, wrote a book called The Night of the Gun. And the whole setup for The Night of the Gun is he doesn't remember what happened. He was so messed up, he has no idea what happened. And so the whole book is him going, he used the techniques he uses of journalism. He goes and interviews other people about it. So it becomes, he sort of used the Rashomon effect to his advantage in moving it forward. The other book I can think of off the top of my head is by Bill Clegg, who wrote a book called The Portrait of the Addict as a young man. In which, at one point, you go with him so convincingly into his hallucination, his cocaine-fueled hallucination, even though it's becoming odder and odder, you're like, wow, the taxi driver's a narc? Oh my God. And then you suddenly realize, the guy's hallucinating, but he's taken you with him. So there are ways to do it, in which you say, look, I know this isn't true, but I don't know what was true, so I'm just going to put it out there. Those are two very different ways of doing it. But in terms of, as we were saying before, in terms of taking time to tell a story, the one memoir that I can think of, it's a beautiful one, that doesn't take any time at all, is Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking, which she wrote really shortly after her husband and her daughter both died. But she's such a master. I mean, that's not like, you don't do that you don't attempt, or you can attempt it in the first book, but it's a very rare gift. And I think through that you can see the hand of the master who has been synthesizing material and turning it into story, into narrative her whole life.
And I think in her case, the impulse to heal both herself and the potential reader through this catharsis, is that perfect intermingling of the aesthetic and the really deeply vulnerable human reaction to a personal tragedy. So I think you're right. She had the chops and the experience, but also just the strategy of, she made no bones about, like, this is a recent event.
Yeah.
So I think, most writers, particularly, the less experienced writers, are ill-advised to try to handle, even if they're using it for fiction. I think you want to let some things simmer, and just like you shouldn't make any decisions when you're angry, in life.
Right.
It's painful with art, especially if you're lucky enough to have it published. That's also something I think we can admonish, starting out writers. That's going to live forever. So again, the responsibility aspect is with a capital R. You owe it to the subject, you owe it to your reader, but you kind of owe it to yourself. because once it's out there, you're telling a story that is literally in print, and you have to live with that. So there's a lot that goes in. But rather than get more tangled up in that, I think it's especially coming from your perspective as kind of a master craftswoman and teacher. I know when I've talked to people over the years, again, it seems very simple, but what I tell people, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, but if someone says, well, I don't even know where to begin, I think with any type of writing, but very much true for a memoir, is get it all out. Don't edit as you go. You need the first draft or first few drafts to be messy and full of stuff that you will later know that might be a very powerful scene, but it doesn't support the narrative arc. And that's, again, I think the difference between experienced and less experienced writers. I think it's Hemingway or whoever. You have to kill your babies, but you've got to put it all out there, and then you go back later. But I think I use it as a way of encouraging any writer, which is to say the first draft, unless you are Faulkner, your first draft is probably not going to be great. But the key thing is to get it down unfiltered, and then the real work comes in through the revision and editing process.
Yeah, and I think that giving yourself license to do that is harder than one might imagine, because, well, I'm an editor by profession, so I probably am the most guilty of this, of over editing. But it is true, you just need to get it down and then look at it later. I would add too that one thing I found helpful is pick a smaller arc sometimes. Write an essay. Use your material and write an essay, or write 2 essays or 3 essays, even if they're not essays you're ever going to publish. Because in so doing, what you're doing is you're taking a smaller task, a more doable task in a way, and getting into the material that way. I find that tends to work the same way that in a workshop, writing from prompts is another way to sort of, jumpstart into something. But we all have to kind of fake ourselves out, because if we are our own worst enemies. That's always true. And, I think back to all the many writers at work interviews I edited when I was at the Paris Review, which was a true gift I felt, and a privilege when I was young. How many writers talk about that, about the need to just keep getting it out there and just trust that you will find your way. The only thing that really throws up a huge boulder in the middle of your path is going to be if you decide to talk to yourself too much about it and you get yourself all screwed up. So in that way, it's sort of an act of faith.
Yes, very much so. And I think kind of related to that is another thing you read about over and over again when we read interviews with writers. And I suspect you and I can both speak about from personal experiences, the idea that you also have to respect your subconscious and the flow. And even no matter what your intentions are, once you're doing the work, you may pleasantly surprise yourself with the depths of description or a way of relating something that you may have seen in a very linear fashion, but comes out very poetically, and respecting the fact that you can't plan it all out. You have to have, I think, especially with a memoir, a notion of getting from point A to point B, but you also have to respect the process and leave room for discovery, and things you thought might have been minor notes turn out to be very important parts, and vice versa. So I think some of that is, again, getting back to just letting the story breathe when you're in the early stages.
I think that's true. And I often tell my students that a memoir workshop is really like a design build class, but we're using memory and story as our building blocks. And sometimes something that begins over here might end up over here, or might not end up anywhere, or might end up just as being a foundational suggestion somewhere else. And the only thing to do is just keep building and see where it leads. And at some point, the goalposts come down, right? At some point, you see what is going to be the beginning and what might be the end. And then you can work with that. Sometimes not. Sometimes the end can be elusive all the way through, or the beginning may end up in the middle. for me, with All Happy Families, I knew pretty early on that I was going to start with my mother walking into the sea in 1983, and that I was going to end it the last time I saw our family house in 2003. So that was just a happy accident that it was a 20-year span. But it was also, for me, sort of the span between when the house had had a life, a family life. And the last time I saw it, the house was no longer ours. It had been demolished from the inside out. So when I went back to see it, it was all just sort of broken apart and charred. It was before, I suppose, they carried off the final scaffolding. And there was something about that that was so powerful that it seemed to me like that was the post I wanted to put down in the conclusion. So once I had that 20-year sense of an arc, it made the situation seem a little more doable.
Right. Another thing, when we talked last summer at the 1455 Literary Festival, I think what we talked a bit about something that I think is really overlooked, and that's the concept of humor, and how the humor can, and in many cases should be, a very necessary, we see it from everything from Shakespeare to, memoir writing, the idea that to take some of the heaviness out, we have to remember that there's a lot of moments of levity. And again, to do that with some expertise requires understanding what the humor is being used for, or when it's being used, and how to use it, not as a counterweight to the heaviness, but to provide that perspective that, again, no matter how good the writing, if it's all heavy and all dark and all somber, no matter how truthful and evocative, it's going to not be a fully immersive reading. So maybe talk a little bit about how you perceive that and teach that, and how necessary it is in any type of writing.
Well, humor is necessary when it occurs naturally. The worst thing you can do is say, oh my God, I don't have enough humor in here, and try to force it, right? I mean, that's just going to sound such a really foul note. So it's been my experience that people who can see the irony in situations tend to be able to utilize humor successfully, or more successfully than those who don't, because there is an ironic tinge in many, many things. For example, I put in a scene after my mother had passed away. My two sisters and I had to go to the funeral home to identify the body, and we were going to pick an urn for her ashes because we knew we were taking them to a lake in Switzerland to join my father's ashes there. And we got into this scuffle about my youngest sister wanted to get this rather expensive urn because it was turquoise and it matched our mother's favorite muumuu that she used to wear. And we're having this fight while this very lugubrious funeral director is sitting there trying to do paperwork. And I suddenly looked up, and it just happened to be that the way his office was situated and the door was open, there was a big no exit sign right by the back door, which was like above his head. And I had to interrupt the proceedings and say, do you realize there's a no exit sign here and you're a mortician? To see things like that. And then that was sort of in my head all these years. That kind of irony, I think at times is important, especially when you're doing something like identifying your mother's body in a funeral home. That's, one example. But then, of course, there are other writers who are wonderful, wonderful writers who don't really have humor in their toolbox and still have made really resonant work. It's just, again, humor is really important as long as it comes along naturally and not if it's forced.
Yeah, and it reinforces, what we talked about at the beginning, which is this notion of emotional truth and truth with a capital T. I think for any hope of what we might, call a universal resonance. Humans, part of any story is combining the tragic and the comic, and so being perceptive of the ironies that are manifold in life and in one's own experience, that will register on a deeper level with a reader, because of course they can recognize that their own lives are full of inconsistencies and commonalities, and one need not have had an experience remotely similar to yours, but still think about Thanksgiving dinners or Christmases or whatever, and it's all there and it's all felt. But being cognizant, in the planning stage and in the writing stage, of wanting to give a more nuanced and full version of how life occurs. I think that's where the humor, when it's appropriate, can it augment what otherwise would still be a nice work, but might need some of that additional humanity, so it doesn't seem too kind of heavy and esoteric.
Yes, I think that's true. And if you think of memoir in terms of putting order, in this case narrative order, on what would otherwise be sort of the disheveled chaos of memory and trauma, I think one of the things you do as you're writing is you sit with the characters, particularly if they're characters who are no longer alive. My mother hasn't been alive since 2003. And I had to really listen for her voice. In some places I didn't, because it was so insistent and bellowing. But in other places I did, often in the quieter places where she said something that was sort of against character, but that were also very important. For example, I knew at some point I had forgiven her, or tried to forgive her, or at least understand why she insisted on going ahead with a huge event when our father was, he died the next day. And that was no surprise that was going to happen. And it wasn't until she and I were up in the attic 20 years, or no, I guess it was 5 years after the wedding, when I was already getting a divorce. Surprise, surprise, given the way this whole thing happened. And we had never opened the wedding presents because she had shoved them all up to the attic, since we were setting the stage, or she was setting the stage for a funeral. The day after the wedding, she said, get all this clutter out of here. So all the presents unwrapped went up to the attic. So she and I were up there 5 years later, opening them up so that we could separate what was mine and what was my husband's. And at one point she said to me, I wish I could have been a better mother to you the weekend of the wedding, but I was numb. And it took me a long time to remember that was what she had said. I knew I had let her off the hook, but it was like well into what should have been the final draft of the book, and I still didn't have that. And I was just walking the dogs one day in Brooklyn, and I suddenly remembered it, and tied them up to a lamppost and wrote it down. But that is the kind of thing that you sort through, or you can attempt to sort through, that's part of the narrative, ordering the chaos. And in that way, it's a great service. I feel strongly that everybody, not every writer, but everybody has a story in them. And as a teacher and editor, I feel that it's been my task to lure that story out of people. It's a little bit harder when the table is turned and you have to lure it out of yourself.
Sure.
But I do believe that. I do believe that we all have stories we can tell. If everybody could take a memoir workshop, I think it would be a fascinating thing.
Well, what a wonderfully unprompted segue to me informing everyone watching that the 1455 Summer Literary Festival is proceeding as planned, albeit entirely virtual. And while just like this conversation was not how it was originally drawn up, I think we're finding a significant silver lining in the possibility of reaching a lot more people and being even more inclusive in terms of content and people that can participate. But I'm so delighted to announce that Jeanne will be conducting a free workshop on memoir during the festival. Details to come, but always go check out 1455litarts.org for info. But what we're going to be doing after that is rolling out some online and virtual resources for a more deeper dive and more formal workshops that Jeanne will be helping us conduct. And I would love you to talk a little bit about how some of this, right? Like, it's so au courant right now. We're all adjusting and struggling to adapt to, what's increasingly looking like the new normal. And I think it's suffice to say we're all dealing with the big picture as well as we can. But in terms of this opportunity, you have a significant amount of what we might respectfully call older school experience with the traditional model, in-person workshops. That was how it was. I think those of us that are adapting successfully and with a positive perspective are recognizing, okay, you can't and shouldn't try to approximate the intimacy of an in-person event, whether it's a festival or a workshop, but the opportunity of being able to reach more people and have these kind of discussions and workshops. How are you feeling about going forward, and what are some of the advantages of being able to reach more people and do the same work in ways that we just may not have imagined because we didn't have to a year or 5 ago?
Well, I think you're right. That's a significant silver lining to the situation we all find ourselves in. Thank God we have technology, right? If this had happened when we were kids, well, it would have been a totally different story.
Sure.
And I do think in terms of workshops, I hope it will engage more interested people who want to write. In being virtual, really, geography is not a problem. Travel costs are not a problem. And because of that, there can still be a very intimate experience. You don't even have to get out of your PJs in order to have it, right? Yeah. And I think that you also, as an instructor, you're able to really dig into people's objectives and really help them bring stories out into the world. At least that's what I plan to do. I know from all of the many in-person workshops I've done for my own workshop, the Todos Santos Writers Workshop, but also elsewhere, that one of the most important tools, and this sounds sort of Pollyanna-ish, but it's not, is willingness. Willingness to do the hard work, to grapple with memory, to expose parts of yourself that you may not want to look at yourself, let alone put out there on the page. And just trust that in so doing, you are ordering a form of chaos, and you are part of the oldest tradition of storytelling there is, right? Which is narrative storytelling. And in that way, I think it's going to be a wonderful experience for all of us. And I think it's a gift that we're going to be able to do it through you.
Well,
1455.
Beautifully put and greatly appreciated. But yeah, I would just love to add to that. You articulate it wonderfully, and I'm so thrilled and honored that you're part of this vision going forward. But I would just like to second the enthusiasm in terms of not seeing this, for people watching right now and kind of contemplating how they can remain engaged or re-engage. It's not a substitute so much as, and it's not a silver lining so much as a real opportunity for an intimacy that was, I think none of us imagined, without the distraction of travel and having to get dressed. They're an expense and so forth, or how you feel that day. Having this technology is very empowering and I think can lead to even more intense and more productive interaction with fellow workshoppers and certainly the instructor. So I think we've sufficiently conveyed our positivity about this, but I really think that this has been a discernible blessing despite everything that's going on in the world, and with all genuine acknowledgement of that. I think we are in a time where, and I'm sure every generation and every situation says this, but this is a time for narrative. It's a time for storytelling, and everyone that's living through these times probably has something meaningful to share.
Yeah,
So let's
I,
take advantage of this and encourage it in each other.
I would say that. And I would say, I mean, the one thing that is obvious that we will lack is the sense of community in which we're all sitting around drinking coffee together, whatever. However, that said, the community will be expanded, right? Because people from anywhere can come in. And as a consequence, I think we might be able to share more freely ideas and experience in that way. Online workshops have been going on for a long time, but they don't necessarily go on the way this is going to be in terms of being an event, an experience. And for everybody to be a part of that community allows every writer, writers write in isolation. Community, literary communities are ways to broaden that experience so that you're not in isolation. And that will still be true, even if you're not in front of the coffee urn talking to the person you just met, but you're at home in your PJs, you're still not alone. And that's what's important. And you've got support.
Absolutely. And I think, I've certainly written and talked a lot about 1455. The primary impulse and mission, right, is to, of course, celebrate and promote creativity, but the notion of community, how important it is for us as humans, how critical it is for writers who, of course, are often working necessarily in solitude. It's very important, and everyone needs that encouragement and that solidarity. And that's something that, whether it's in person or online, you still can't duplicate. And it's a very critical part of this whole process.
And one thing that it has been true for many, many people is they have been alone because they've had to be alone for the last 2 months, right? Or you're with your family, which is fabulous. But, I know quite a few people who are actually living alone and don't see people. And again, hopefully the restrictions will have lifted a bit, but whether they have or they haven't, again, this is a way to get out of that isolation.
Absolutely. And again, I'll say, my vision, and I don't want to be too cute here, but thinking about how we're talking about crafting narrative and storytelling, I mean, I can think back to the early days of this endeavor, 1455, and writing a mission statement that was very aspirational. And, building a writer's retreat, a physical space, that was the easiest part in terms of the conception. But I had this notion all along, and I articulated it without really seeing it, was I want this to be inclusive. I want the site to be robust with resources for writers and somehow have community that's more meaningful than just being there in person. So current events for me, this has been a pleasant surprise. I'm now seeing through necessity ways in which we really can take advantage, despite certain limitations, and really expand and offer resources and offer the opportunity through our ongoing free programming for writers to just check in and feel that they're not alone. Because again, on a human and an artistic level, feeling alone is not where we should be right now. And it's so achievable to overcome that and provide kind of this sustenance and support. And I think you can speak about it. I know I can from my experience at workshops and residencies. It not only empowers you as a human, which is so important, but it makes you a better writer. And I want to leave that impression on people, that interacting with other writers is an act of generosity. It's an act of receiving that generosity and imagination, and it actually enhances your craft.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And really, if this period of time has taught us anything, it's that we're all in this together, even if we're apart together.
That's right. And what more, for me personally, that's, the day-to-day has not changed, because that mission continues. And, the burden is on those of us trying to advance this mission. It's for the collective good. It's certainly personally fulfilling and enriching, but yeah, we all are in this together. And I think that this recent events have made that undeniable, but there's a tremendous amount of inspiration that can come out of that. And
Yeah.
let the
Yeah.
story flow.
Yes, and I look forward, I hope, to meeting some of the people that are listening to this conversation through the workshop. I think that'll be a privilege.
Absolutely. Well, like I said before, please check out, if you're watching this, you'll be on one of our sites. We'll make a lot of information available in the coming weeks. But again, Jane is blessing us with a free workshop about memoir, and that is going to tee up a series of workshops that'll head into hopefully. And the other thing is, of course, for me, I don't look at this as a temporary. I think even we have to assume we return to being able to interact at some point, but the virtual component of these workshops and initiatives should absolutely complement what we continue on with, whether it's a year or two or whatever from now. So we are so excited. We're looking forward to it. And Jane, it's just always a tremendous pleasure to see you and talk to you. I'm grateful for your time.
It's my pleasure.
And it is just wonderful to have the courage to know that we have people like you on board and leading this forward, because it's going to continue to grow, and I think a lot of people will get a lot from it.
Well, onward.
So I'll talk to you soon, and everyone, thanks for checking in. Be safe, be happy, be healthy, and keep writing, and stay tuned for more info about the Lit Fest and a lot of other initiatives coming down the pike.
Okay.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Okay, good. Bye.